Today, I'm delighted to welcome Henrik Hakansson, Global Head of People Analytics at Volvo Cars, to the Digital HR Leaders podcast. Henrik, it's fantastic to have you on the show. To kick things off, I'd love to start with your journey. What led you into the world of people analytics?
Well, thank you, David. Thanks for having me. So if we look back maybe 10 years ago, give or take, that's when I started my journey. I would say started my journey into people analytics, even though it didn't happen until maybe 5 years ago. Because I joined Sony and into sort of a generalist position very early on. And I was asked to do some work on a performance related topic. And I decided to use Excel spreadsheets and do a bit of VLOOKUPs, conditional formatting, and all of a sudden people saw me as sort of the guru in tech in HR, which is kind of telling of where HR was 10 years ago in terms of technology. A month or two after that, we had an opening in the HRSIS organization. So I moved on to that role. And at the time, we were implementing a new global HCM system. So I was put in charge of rolling out Absent globally for Sony. And a couple of months into that, I started realizing we have quite a lot of reporting needs. And basically went to the project lead, what are we doing about reporting? And he said, great, you asked, now you're in charge. So all of a sudden, I was in charge of implementing a reporting strategy, and with that came also data governance, data quality, of course, pieces that were really critical for getting reporting up and running. And this was mainly the focus back then. So we talked about reporting rather than talking about analytics at this time. And a couple of years later, working with the data quality, getting it up to an acceptable standard. As many people know, there's no point in doing analytics if the data quality is bad because you just come to the wrong conclusions. So we got that in place. And then around 2018, 2019, I was asking if we can do something more with reporting and sort of had that vision for a while. And we started to look into tools and eventually got to build a team in 2019 with Sony. So I got a couple of people together and we started officially on the people analytics journey.
That's and we're going to talk a little bit more about building a team from scratch as you did at Sony, and then obviously they're going to talk into the subsequent roles that you've had at Delivery Hero, and more so obviously now at Volvo Cars where you've been for a year. But been in the space, in or around the space for around 10 years by the sounds of it. And you've built multiple people analytics teams or three people analytics teams during your career. I'd be interested to hear from you, from a practitioner view, how have you seen the function evolve over that time?
I think, as I alluded to in my introduction there, that originally it was very
Mm.
much reporting focused. It was focused on numbers. It wasn't focused very much on insights at all. It was figuring out headcount. It was figuring out maybe attrition. And even that was something like, how do we really calculate that in the best possible way? But it was just numbers and metrics that we needed to report so that the company management was basically happy. And I think it's still a journey in some parts. I still experience people who focus much more on the numbers rather than what the numbers actually are telling us. Now I do see a lot more focus on impact and reasoning around the data, however. And of course, also think maybe this is more what's coming now and in the next coming years is how we connect the people data to all other kinds of data across the organization. Because as I said, data was quite new to HR back then, and it's now more focused on how to use the data in a smart way. We collect tons of data. We have all these HCM systems that store tremendous amounts of data. But one thing is data quality, of course, but also why do we capture all of this? What's in it for the employee to try to understand why should they spend time filling out their personal profile? What benefit does that give them? And I think it's slowly impacting other areas too. And as I said, it was very HR focused in the past, which is also why I tend to say, and I've said this ever since I started the journey, I want to call it people analytics. It's not HR analytics because that insinuates we only do things for HR, and that's not really where the value is to me.
Yeah, and that's exactly why we called the book People Analytics, not HR Analytics. So, but yeah, it kind of gives that outside look view rather than in just thinking about ourselves in HR. And actually, interesting, one of the things you said about data quality, and maybe we'll talk about this a bit later. One of the hypotheses I've got is everyone's talking about AI at the moment, Everyone's talking about personalizing things for employees. Well, if you've got poor data quality, you're not going to be able to do that effectively, and you're certainly not going to be able to do it at scale. So that kind of grounding that you've had across those years around data quality, if you get the data quality right, it allows you to do analytics. I think is definitely going to carry forward to.
And I think just to build on that, it's people used to say garbage in, garbage out, and now with AI, I've heard garbage in, landfill out, because that's how exponentially worse it gets when you try to put bad data into a large language model.
You may hear me use that at a conference near you soon. I will credit you for it though, Henrik. That's I like that one. So yeah, and again, I like the focus there where you were talking about, very much a kind of backward looking, I guess, view and looking at reporting. So it's that kind of hindsight view, looking in the rear view mirror. But as we've seen, as analytics has progressed, people are starting to look, okay, well, how can this help us for what's coming? And I think that I've definitely seen that kind of shift in thinking in HR, not just in people analytics professionals, but in HR leaders as well. And I think that augurs well for the field as we go forward. So let's go back to Sony again, Henrik. So this is where you built your first people analytics team, obviously as effectively a founder, people analytics leader. Can you walk us through that process? What was it like starting from scratch?
I think it was very interesting. In a sense, as you said, back then, maybe if you look at US, some of the really big companies, Google, Microsoft, they had established people analytics, but most other companies hadn't. And we were very early in that journey. So there was little to no best practice, or this is how you do people analytics successfully. So it was very much of a discovery journey. Originally, we didn't have any dedicated tools per se. We had a team that we sort of put together of people who had some experience working with reporting and understanding, but no one came from like an analytical background. So we had to figure out many of these things on our own. And I think one of the challenges I saw that was that analytics was often an afterthought because it wasn't naturally part of the process. It was something that came afterwards. Now we've delivered this solution. How do we make any use of it, or how do we see if it's an effective process or something? But it was always afterwards. It wasn't part of the design process. And I think this was one of the biggest challenges coming into or trying to build a new function that no one had any experience in working with in the past. So it's very reactive and quite limited impact as well, because again, it wasn't something that came maybe from the very top that now we need to establish people analytics. It's more we start seeing this trend within HR tech that maybe analytics should be a focus. So it grew maybe from bottom up rather than top down perspective. And I think also one of the challenges that we didn't have that demand since people didn't necessarily know we existed. It was much more we had to try building things based on ideas rather than a demand or a request from someone. But over time, people started realizing the more things we built, the more questions came. And we reached this tipping point where the solutions sell themselves essentially. But it is a bit of a journey to get to that point, and convincing people that we need to spend a couple of weeks building this, and you won't see any progress until we're done. So having that investment is also, people tend to question what you're doing if they don't see any results of what you expected. And in the end, I think one of the other in a way fun challenges was that we used a tool that it was sort of an early access kind of tool with no one else really using it, maybe compared to some other more common analytics tools. So there was no way of Googling things. They had a bespoke coding language, which made us try to figure things out on our own. We had great support from the vendor, but it's still one of these things that looking back maybe would have been better going with something that was, more established or something that we could learn from. But again, it helped us build our bespoke solutions as well.
And also, we're going to get to the next stage of your journey in a minute. But I was wondering if you could if you think all the way back to that time, and we'll have some people, listening to this episode who are maybe founding a people analytics function in their company for the first time. Yes, I think there's more information out there to help them to do that now, and probably better technology out there to help them to scale that. But if you could go back and you could do one thing differently, what would that one thing be? And then if there's one thing that you did that really helped you, what would that be as well?
I think one of the biggest differences was when I was at Sony, went to the US for an assignment, and that was based on me showcasing some of the dashboards we were building. But even back then, dashboards were a new thing. It was very cool. I know the discussion a lot surrounds now, basically talking, do we still need dashboards or should everything go into Gen AI? But at the time, we got to present this to the right people. And I think this is one of the biggest things, being able to get the audience. When I was in the US, I worked with the leadership team, the executive team of North America, and that was completely different questions, completely different buy-in, and it also helped the function understand. I know you're a big proponent of talking about, talking to the right people, but I think this is the best thing that we could do. It was very much focused on more of a delivery support function. But if you want to be a proactive strategic partner, which is how I see people analytics, then you need to have the right dialogue with the right people in the organization, which tends to be the more senior people. And then one thing to be mindful of there is also maybe not trying to shove it down someone's throat if they're not interested, because there were some people who were more interested than others. And we'll get to that in a minute, perhaps when we talk about my journey, but finding the people who are interested and working with them, that's the biggest benefit rather than, and then they can sort of help build the interest and the relevance of what you're doing rather than trying to convince people who are sort of against what you're trying to do.
Yeah. Yeah, as you said, identify the right stakeholders, find the ones that care, meet them where they are, you know,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
then obviously as you start to have success, there will be your advocates to help you kind of grow within the organization. I think it's good. And maybe one thing you do differently.
One thing I do differently, I think, uh, being mindful of how much work it is. I think what I've learned over doing it in my my other companies is that things take time and not over promising. My new motto nowadays is under promise, over deliver, because you always think that things are going to be simpler than they are. And they're not, especially when it comes to things that you don't control. I mean, I can be in charge of data quality, but that doesn't mean I'm going and fixing 50,000 records that are might be incorrect somewhere. So, building the partnership is important, but also being mindful that things will take time and explaining that to people as well.
It's that kind of balance of being ambitious but being realistic as well,
Exactly.
trying to find a happy medium between the two. So yeah, we as I said earlier, you've also scaled people analytics teams now in your third company, so Sony, Delivery Hero, and now Volvo Cars, and in different industries as well. What were the key differences in building those functions across such diverse organizations?
I think, as we already talked a bit about Sony, but there everything was new. It was new in the people analytics on its own was new. So that was one of the bigger challenges. It was a relatively small team, as I said, a bit of a limited visibility of how we were organized, because maybe we hadn't realized what people analytics could do at the time. And it was a very much focus on just getting started and seeing what can we do with this function in the long term. I think moving on to Delivery Hero, that was a tech, or that it is a tech company. So it's born out of data, which is quite different. Only been around for now, I think it's 12 years, but when I joined, it was around not even 10 years old. So there wasn't all the legacy. There were custom solutions. It's more, you throw a bunch of things at the wall and see what sticks. That's the mentality. So you build tons of different things, but I needed to take a step back there as well. And that was what I learned from Sony, to really build a solid foundation, which again took time. But once we had that foundation, we could scale and basically run with our solutions very quickly. And I think also at Delivery Hero was a big change when sort of we had the money, and then in 2022 the whole market changed, and most of these startups where the investors wanted to see actual value. And all of a sudden, we needed to go from very much of a growth company, hiring hundreds of people in a single location every month, to focus more on a sustainable long-term organization and cost savings. So I think that was also very different, especially when it's such a fast-paced market. Things are changing very, very rapidly. And then going on to Volvo Cars, I think here the organization existed when I came, but they hadn't had a leader for about 18 months when I joined. So there was a bit of a gap between the former strategy and where people analytics was today, or rather 1 year ago when I joined. So there was a bit of a lack of strategy and direction, which was then up to me trying to rethink how we wanted to be organized. Very large organization, of course, but there is investment and willingness. But as I said, the difference between perhaps Delivery Hero and Volvo Cars is there is a lot of legacy. Volvo Cars is an almost 100-year-old company with the tools and the systems and the culture that comes with that, for better, for worse. But there is a lot of complexity when it comes to an organization with this kind of legacy. Just moving on from an old HCM system to a new one, for example, takes years. Whereas in a new company, maybe it takes a couple of months because you don't have anything, you don't need to migrate, you don't need to do that. And I think here it's also a lot of focus on the cross-functional topics, which is really interesting. We've established the data and analytics community, which is really trying to build this data mesh across the organization. So there's huge potential, in my opinion, and also means a lot of people are involved, a lot of opinions. And we have a saying that the hippo, the highest paid person's opinion, we want to try to steer away from that and build proper processes to make sure we deliver what's actually the company value rather than the person shouting the loudest. But it takes a bit of time to find your place. But at the same time, a very appreciative audience when you do things right.
And a couple of things about maybe now focusing on Volvo Cars. You've been there a year. What would you say your key achievements have been in those 12 months? What does the team look like? And I love that, and again, maybe developing a bit on that data and analytics community. You talked about connecting people data with business data to solve business problems. I presume that's part of that plan to do that.
Absolutely. I think on the achievement side, for me, it was establishing the right organization, a bit based on my experience, but also now we do start to see trends in best practices. So it's a little bit easier to rely on things that you can also explain that this works. I know from experience what works. But we had a very scattered organization. We had resources that were borrowed. We had consultants part-time working for us. It was very sort of lacking in control and very siloed way of working when I came in. We were delivering things, but at the same time, it wasn't maybe as efficient, or there was no North Star to aim for. It was more of a delivery support function. So one of the biggest achievements to me is establishing this organization now with a back end of data engineers, data governance specialists, front end developers, or business intelligence engineers, and what I like to call analytics partners. I know you refer to them more as consultants or translators, but essentially the same kind of role. Just since we have a lot of consultants in this company, I try to avoid using that terminology. And also position them more as partners, because I don't want us to just be on the receiving end. I want us to be involved in the discussions. And I think this establishing the stakeholder management model, which is also partly based on what you've put together in your book, around identifying the key people. We had hundreds of people reaching out to us, asking for different things, and how do we know which one to prioritize? So we've tried to establish sort of key people to work with, and putting a bit of the discipline and responsibility back in the functions to give their priorities to us. Otherwise, we end up having multiple different requests, maybe from the same function, saying, let's say engineering, having different requests depending on who you ask in that function. And this then also lends its hand to the DNA community. So people analytics was one of the hubs. We have 9 hubs, as we call them. We use a federated hub and spoke model, which is a sort of a center of data and analytics core and platform functionality centrally, who gives us the frameworks, the policies, sort of the frames of which we can operate in, and then we can decide within those frames how we want to run things in each hub. And then we have specialized, perhaps analysts working more as spokes. So for example, if we want to have someone specifically working with our Chinese organization, then that could be a spoke dedicated to that area. And I think this works quite well. We work with the other hubs, and unfortunately, many of them were also established about a year ago. So this has been definitely a big journey for Volvo Cars and a big investment as well. And I think what we discuss now is how do we share data in the best possible way between these hubs. We, for example, have a potential to do things very closely with finance, as people cost is very relevant, and a lot of the metrics that finance looks at are related to people. Then, of course, we also have engineering, manufacturing, supply chain, these other functions that might be more interesting if you look at things like engagement. How does that impact our productivity in the factories and these kind of things? So I think that's more for the future, but we're not quite there yet, as we're still establishing a lot of the foundations across these hubs on making sure we still adhere to GDPR. I mean, just as much as we have people data, we also have customer data that is very sensitive. So we need to be mindful of how we do this in the best possible way.
That's right. I mean, actually, I mean, I know we've spoken about this previously, Henrik. I mean, you've achieved a lot in a year.
Thank you.
You know, you've effectively re-established the foundations. You've brought a disparate team together into one and got the right skills and team organized around you. You're identifying the priorities, and you know, you're also building the data and analytics community across the organization and deepening those partnerships with, you know, finance in particular. If you work together with finance, you're probably gonna, or I'm sure you are, you're working on stuff that's going to have an impact on bottom line. And if you're working with engineering, you're going to have stuff that's probably going to impact on top line. So, you know, you're really setting yourself up for success, I think. And I think it shows that when you've done this before in other organizations, you can bring those learnings into a new role as a head of people analytics. Again, I think interesting when we look at the background that you've got in those three companies, you know, working with both white collar and blue collar workforces. You know, I'd be interested in, again, thinking about the people listening to this that maybe are responsible for different groups of employees as in people analytics and in HR for that matter. You know, did the differences in managing these two types of workforce reflect the challenges that you faced in people analytics?
I think definitely. At Sony, we didn't have so much to do with the blue collar population, even though there was definitely that group as well. But I think this has been most prevalent at Volvo Cars. I think one of the biggest differences is demographics, in terms of who works in the different, who's a white collar and who's a blue collar worker at Volvo Cars. And it's also that the office environment is very different to a plant. If someone's sick, for example, for a day, if you're in the office, that's fine. You'll probably show up the next day or the next week and you can catch up on all your emails and things that you missed out on. If someone doesn't show up to the factory, the production line essentially stops. So we need to have sort of much more continuous way of working with our blue collars. It's quite a different environment. And you brought up people listening as well, which I think is interesting because we've had quite a challenge. As I said, if someone leaves their position on the production line, that means someone else needs to cover for them. And most of the blue collar workers, they don't have their own laptops. They don't need it necessarily. So if they are to answer people listening, like an engagement survey, for example, they actually need to leave and someone needs to take their spot while they're away. And how do we ensure that we give people enough time to actually respond in a good way, or is it just, you know, go there, do that quickly so you can come back? So how do we rely on the results? And this has been a very big discussion with our data protection and cybersecurity organization as well, to make sure that what we collect, we give them the right sort of conditions to actually be able to provide us with the right input. And as I said, it's a continuous way of working in the factories. It doesn't stop. We deliver or build cars 24/7, whereas an office is maybe the usual 8 to 5 or 9 to 5 kind of work. So I think those are quite interesting challenges. And I think then there are very specific questions that we might ask, but I think that's also a journey. We have dedicated analysts who sits with the plants, just to have sort of the close feeling so that it's not corporates coming in and telling you this is how you should do things, but we actually need to have sort of the context of what's going on in the plants to make sure we deliver the right kind of analytics.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, for example, you know, if you're looking at the plants, then you're probably looking at the link between engagement and safety. Whereas if you're looking in other parts, you're looking at maybe the link between, you know, EMPS and CMPS, for example. I'm not saying you are, by the way. I'm just saying that you might do that. And that's obviously very different. And then in your white collar workers, you might be looking at the impact of hybrid on things like innovation and collaboration. But that's not even a question in the blue collar workforce. Everyone's in the office. Everyone's in their place of work. You know, so So I guess it does. It kind of creates, it's a more broader set of work for you, I guess, as a people analytics function. And as you said, it's important that you've got people who've got that context to actually understand that the different environments, so that you're directing the work in the right way, I guess.
Yeah, and I think just to build on that very quickly is also about listening to the organization, because there's always the feeling that, okay, now corporate is deciding this or top management is deciding that. But I think it's very key as part of people analytics to really let everyone be heard and understanding how this impacts people. When I established the strategy of Volvo Cars, I mean, I could have taken exactly what I did at Sony and Delivery Hero and just say, this is what we're going to do. But I realized, no, I need to listen. Where are we? What do people find troublesome? And what do we need to focus on? And then adapt the strategy. As I said, people analytics doesn't necessarily have a best practice that works flawlessly everywhere. We have ideas and we have principles. And then we need to make sure we listen to everyone, whether that's white collar or blue collar. I think it's really important.
And as you said, you get some of that context by doing what you said earlier around, who are the key stakeholders, what are their priorities, how can we support them from a people analytics perspective, maybe even getting out yourselves and walking around a plant, for example, and just seeing how things work. And then, as a smart guy like you are, you'll see that, okay, well, this is maybe where we can direct some of the work here. And talking to people is a great way to learn, isn't it?
Exactly, and it's still on my to-do list. We have something we call the Blue Train at Volvo, which allows us to go into the factory and see how a car is made. And I think that's something that everyone needs to do to really understand how your daily work affects what we actually produce, what ends up on the roads in the end.
No, really good, really good. So as you've kind of moved past when you started at Sony, focusing on reporting, as you've moved more into advanced analytics like predictive modeling, sentiment analysis, NLP, and others, how did you build the internal relationships and get stakeholder buy-in for these initiatives? Particularly, I guess, as some of the stakeholders won't necessarily understand these analytical methods. Yeah, I'm interested. Just interested how you've done that.
I was going to say, I think we're quite early stages at Volvo Cars on this journey. I think everyone's very much into Gen AI. I wrote an article, I know you've read it, about how people just want AI now. AI will solve everything, but maybe we need to stop and ask, what is the actual problem we're trying to solve? Does AI make sense?
Exactly.
And I think this may be more where we went a little bit further at Deliver Hero. And at the time, no one was really asking so much for. I mean, we were a tech company, but people weren't so much into Gen AI. ChatGPT didn't exist when we started this journey. It was sort of pre-Gen AI, and post-Gen AI is quite different, I think. We built an attrition predictor. We had one person spending Fridays or a couple of hours every week. No one asked for this. I knew we had a bit of a challenge with attrition in the tech market on the startups, so a lot of people moving around. So we wanted to understand if we could somehow see any benefits from that. So it took about 6 months since we didn't have any dedicated efforts on working with this. But over those 6 months, we developed a product and we showed a concept. And all of a sudden, people started realizing, oh, this is what we can do with people analytics or more advanced things, because people again were thinking, oh, people analytics is just dashboards, it's metrics, it's headcount, it's turnover, and that's it. But this really helped us get buy-in. We also showed it to some of the people outside of HR to sort of help leverage their opinions as well, and drive the conversation. And in this case, the product didn't eventually hit the market because we needed to rebuild it. We had some data privacy challenges in how we predict without consent, and then we couldn't use that data for anything. So in the end, we decided to rebuild that into a team identifier instead. So it was not personally identifiable, and then it was fine to use. But this also helped us build a very close relationship with our CTO at the time, who was, of course, when you're in meetings with him, he was asking, like, how did we build an integration? What's the logic behind this and this? Questions that we perhaps wouldn't get from the HR community in the same way. And I think this was really helpful because when he was interested, he would come to us. And then when he starts using things, that sort of forces the rest of the C-level and the other senior managers to also really want to use this kind of technology. So I think for us, it was trying to experiment with something because we knew no one was realistically going to ask for it until then Gen AI showed up. Now everyone's asking for it, but then we need to take a step back and figure out what makes sense. And I think, again, what we talked about data quality before, I think this is such a big part that we need to solve first, the whole data governance, the ownership, the accountability of the data before we start building super advanced technology. Because again, we can do it on subsets of data that might be easier to do just as a concept, but then we really need to figure out what makes sense and what is the relevant, because as you know, building advanced models are generally a little bit more time consuming than just putting together a dashboard or some quick analysis.
Which, as going back to the first point you made, makes it even more important. Is firstly start with what's the business problem you're trying to solve,
Yeah.
And then we'll apply the most relevant analytical methodology or AI or whatever it is to try and solve it. Yeah, I love that article. It's just it's the first rule of people analytics, really, isn't it? What's the business problem you're trying to solve? Rather than do something really fancy. I remember Andrew Marriott at a conference a few years ago. His point was that it's not always the most sophisticated analytics that has the biggest impact. Sometimes it can be really simple stuff that directed in the right way.
Exactly. And in my sort of maturity model of people analytics, I used to show that, everything needs to go towards AI and ML, but in reality, a basic spreadsheet could do the same thing, depending on what the question is.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be very advanced.
Good lesson, I think, for hopefully anyone listening to this in people analytics that's maybe have a deluge of requests from either their colleagues in HR or people in the business to do AI. Interesting. So again, Henrik, three times obviously building a team. What skills and capabilities did you invest in to support the growth and delivery of the people analytics function? And maybe that's for Volvo Cars, I guess, given it's the current one.
Yeah. And as I mentioned before, we have data engineers, we have business intelligence engineers, we have data governance specialists. Under my umbrella, we also have talent intelligence, and then what I call analytics partners. I think the talent intelligence is quite interesting as well. When we talk about people analytics is very young, then talent intelligence is sort of branching out from that even younger area, and lots of potential, but of course much more difficult because you're working primarily with external data. So there's a completely different set of skills of more data mining, scraping, and modeling of external data, and also being aware that you will most likely never have 100% of the data that you need. Within people analytics, at least we can assume that we own the data. We can try to collect as much as possible. The reason I have this set up is also because we have sort of a build mentality, and this is how we build. When I came in, there was always the data warehouse was almost complete. So for me, it didn't make sense to go with buying a solution. I think if we bought a solution, then maybe focus would be on different kinds of skills. But for me, I need the data engineers, but we also work closely with our IT organization. And as I said, the data and analytics community to be able to leverage resources and capacity from others. So we don't have to build the same team over and over in every hub, but we can actually utilize the competence across. Some of the hubs have gone further. For example, they have ML and AI specialists. We're not quite there, in my opinion. I have some of the people on my team are very strong in statistics and modeling. So we have some of that competence, but we don't have any dedicated resources for it quite yet. But as I said, if we look back at the skills I'm looking for, people analytics is still quite hard to find people with years of experience working in any kind of role within people analytics. So I tend to hire people with passion, if I'm being honest. I think if you have the passion, you're interested, you want to learn, then these are the people that will be really good at their jobs. Two of my best hires have been a learning partner who had basically no technical background. In 3 months, she started learning SQL and visualizations and querying data in a really good way. And all of a sudden, she was one of my strongest analytics partners at the time. So I think this has really a lot of potential if you're interested, rather than hiring for skills. As I said, mainly because it's so hard to find people with years of skills or experience in people analytics.
Yeah, curiosity, and
Yeah.
that is such an important skill. I mean, particularly in analytics. I think, and I guess by having that data and analytics community, you potentially have, and as I guess your colleagues in the other functions do, you have the ability to borrow resources from each other, to collaborate on things together. If you've got a shared goal, particularly, I don't know if it's people analytics and engineering, for example, to solve a problem related to that. And then you've got the careers opportunities for people as well to move between different kind of analytics areas and different parts of the business as well, which I guess is helpful for retaining some of that talent within Volvo Cars.
I was going to say, just to build on that, I think that that's one of the main goals with the DNA community, as we call it. So some of the hubs are really big, some of the hubs are very small. I mean, I think that our sustainability hub is like 2 or 3 people at the moment, and then there's other hubs with 50, 60, 70 people. And of course, you can't grow maybe in the role that you want, but maybe there's another opportunity within this domain. And if everyone works together, it's not going to be such a large switch or sort of jump to something completely different. So I think that's a big enabler of retention for us as well.
And it sounds like from the way you outlined some of those key skills, you've got, similar to the operating model work research that we've done at Insight 22, you've got that front end, the analytics partners working directly with business leaders and HR business partners, presumably, to identify and prioritize work, to educate stakeholders, I guess, a little bit sometimes about what can be done. Then you've got the engine in the middle that's kind of doing the work, essentially doing the analytics, but making sure that you'll continue looking at quality, at governance, and everything else, and plugging it into each other with the engineers. And then presumably that then you're thinking about, okay, adoption, I guess, in terms of, okay, well, how if we're designing this for this part of the business, is it something that we can potentially roll out to other parts of the organization? And if we're going to do that, what's the change management process in that? What's the adoption process in that as well? It sounds like you've got all those kind of skills within your team, but you've also got access to additional skills in the data and analytics community if needs be as well.
Yeah, and that's the intention of having these, as you said, well, you caught me. I've been using the model a bit, but it's also from experience. As you said, I mean, your research is based on what other companies are doing,
exactly.
and we find this to be a very strong model, where you have these people who are somewhat technical, but their real skills is understanding business and translating that into a technological solution. So can we do this? I think this is sometimes the question we need to ask when people have business challenges. And what I found is many times, especially within HR, people will not come to us and say, I need this dashboard. They might come, or you hear in passing that we have this issue. Then you need to have someone who can think, how do I translate that into some kind of analytical product or solution that we can help them solve that question? And that's quite a difficult skill, I think, to have both of those sides. And also the ability to perhaps create a mock-up or proof of concept so that we don't have to bother sort of the production engine with everything, but rather also having some autonomy in the analytics partners themselves.
So let's look a little bit to the future. And I appreciate this isn't always easy to do because it's changing so quickly. What are the sort of areas that you're looking to invest in as you continue to build the people analytics function at Volvo Cars, particularly in line with your objective to obviously create business value?
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned, was mostly talent intelligence. I think people analytics is an area that people nowadays start to understand more and more. People want to invest in it, but we still have an organization that very frequently asks, what is everyone else doing? What is our competition doing? And you might have seen recently that some of the automotive companies are starting to struggle. We are facing a lot of headwinds in the coming months and probably next few years as well, with demand declining and just a challenging environment. So we need to be ahead of the competition. So how can we leverage external data? And that's where talent intelligence comes in. Whether it's regarding like strategic workforce planning or site strategy, where do we want to build a new tech hub, for example? Should we invest when everyone else is laying off so we can sort of vacuum the top talent from other companies? So what's our strategy and what makes most sense? And I think this is where we can really impact the bottom line as well of the company, to really be proactive rather than reactive in the way that we think about our talent or potential future talent. So for me, talent intelligence is a big part. The other thing that we do internally has always been sort of my focus, building this really strong foundation, so that we can walk before we run, so to speak. If we try to build things without a solid foundation, it's going to be a house of cards, and we're going to have to rebuild solutions in 6 months that we develop today because all the data has changed or we don't have a proper integration to our data warehouse, all of these things. So I think investing in a solid backend is also one of my key focus areas for, and then products to support this. So we're working now with a model to build a few key products that will act as a baseline that we can then work on personalizing and democratizing to the business, and also potentially local analysts who want to maybe do their flavor of the products that we develop, but rather still having, this is what headcount is, this is what turnover is, having these basic metrics, this is how we look at engagement, and then allowing people to take it from there.
Very good. And we will come back to the talent intelligence piece because on the later, because we've got the question of the series kind of around workforce planning. So rather than repeating ourselves twice, but yeah, I mean, there's lots of interesting things as you alluded to there around, particularly around talent intelligence and understanding what your competitors are doing, for example. But we'll come back to that. So again, just reflecting maybe a couple of things, really, just reflecting on your journeys at the three organisations. What would you say are the key enablers that have helped you to scale your people analytics functions and deliver more value?
I think we've touched upon it already in to some degree, making sure you have the right relationships and visibility of the team. I think this was also something that really came to me when I was at Volvo Cars. We had a lot of talented people, but there was no sort of representative of people analytics leading them to do work maybe on a lower level than what we really needed to. So me coming in, being able to have the conversations with the right people was a big step up for us. I think single source of truth is also something that is crucial, especially a large company like ours. We have a lot of people wanting to report numbers. Even when I talk across not just the HR community, but there are a lot of managers who have their master spreadsheet, so to speak, of this is my head count, this is how I work with things. But what if we can help people and sort of market and socialize the products that we build so that we don't, our audience is not just HR, but it's actually the whole business. One of our biggest, I would say, audiences would be our people managers. Doesn't mean you have to be C-level, but just generally democratizing so everyone in the organization has a good understanding of the demographics, diversity of the organization, even basic things like understanding tenure and performance, but enabling people to see that on a managerial level. So again, it's one thing, yes, we want to focus on the C-level, of course, because that's where a lot of the bottom line value is. But I think to really get buy-in and understanding why people analytics is important, it is to socialize also with the rest of the organization, and as I said, not just focus on HR. I think also maybe more longer term is thinking about how we consume data and how people want to consume data. Gen AI might be the solution that we all need to go for eventually. As I said, I don't think we're quite there. Maybe it's like Iron Man with holographic projections that you can spin around using your hands, or maybe it's just a dashboard or report. I think the future is quite uncertain in that sense, but making sure that we can allow people to give, or allow us to give people insights at the right time. I think that's the key drivers for succeeding in this role.
It's very true. I mean, I think a lot of people analytics functions initially focus on enabling their colleagues in HR. Okay, you kind of get that a little bit because I guess the budget's coming ultimately from the CHRO. Then it's about how can we enable our leaders, and I get that as well because as you talked about the hippo and everything else. But if you can enable leaders, that's good as well. That's obviously good stakeholder management. But ultimately, it's about enabling people managers, because if you enable people managers, you're having a much bigger impact on the organisation as a whole. And then the question is, as you said, how do you enable people managers to help them make better decisions in the flow of work? And that will change. That could be a generative AI layer, so they're not actually touching the technology directly. But who knows? Who knows what that's going to be? But maybe that I know this is something you're passionate about. Before we get onto the question of the series, what are some of your strategies for enabling HR professionals and maybe people managers as well with analytics? What are some of the things that what are some of the practices that you've done to help enable your colleagues in HR and people managers in your various companies? But maybe I know you've done something recently at Volvo Cars. So.
Yeah, I think what we really want to focus on is data literacy, enabling people to understand. And this is something we do both with our team. We try to focus on, of course, our community, which is the HR community initially. But
Mm,
also we had a data and analytics conference, an internal conference for all of Volvo. It was open to all of Volvo Cars back in the spring, and that was very a big success. I mean, obviously, mostly focused on the DNA community. They found it very interesting to see, oh, I'm not alone in doing analytics in this company. So it's nice to see colleagues from other places. But I think building up the data literacy is constantly when I go to conferences, when I talk to peers, this is one of the biggest challenges we have, understanding how data can be used. I talk about data driven versus data informed and not making sure people are not scared of the data, but rather use it as sort of augmenting decision. You shouldn't just because you have data that doesn't mean it tells you everything. It's not the entire truth, but having a solid backbone, as I said, a source of truth that I mean, I can trust this data. Maybe it doesn't give me everything I need, but at least I can use this to inform my decisions. And then going out to the organization, doing sort of marketing and socialization, I think is very important because we can spend time building amazing products, but if no one knows about them, that makes it very difficult for people to actually consume it. And then people will still stick around with their spreadsheets or local solutions. And I think part of that is also that becomes time consuming. That also costs money because someone needs to pull a report somewhere when we maybe have a solution ready that could save a lot of people a lot of time. So I think, yeah, data literacy for me is one of the key drivers to democratize data as a whole.
yeah, and I think again, we've seen that with the research that we've done on the characteristics of companies that are creating consistently high value in their people analytics efforts. I think there's a lot of focus, and I guess it comes sometimes from the vendor community about technology helps you to scale, and it does. But unless you enable the data literacy, particularly of our HR colleagues and of people managers more widely, then your scaling is only going to be to a certain limit. So I think you're right to combine the two. The other thing we haven't really talked about, but it's maybe just a point before we get to the question of the series. I mean, you talked that you've got very much got a build strategy at Volvo Cars, and it sounds the way you've articulated that's the right strategy for you at Volvo Cars. You're able to capitalise on what the efforts that have already been done across the organisation. I'm guessing it means that from a people manager perspective, it's consistent. They're getting the information in the same way, whether it's coming from HR or whether it's coming from finance or whether it's coming from other parts of the business. And I think it shows that this whole build versus buy discussion, there's no right answer. It depends. Like many, you've probably worked in organisations before where you've probably where a buy strategy has made more sense. I don't know if you could talk to that a little bit, because again, we'll have people on the call that are maybe considering buying technology at the moment, but maybe having pressure from their IT teams to maybe go with the enterprise approach. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, and if you asked me a couple of years ago, I would probably said build is always the way to go because you have much more control. I think the solutions now from the vendors uh, in this space have become really, really good, very, very strong compared and sort of matured as well as we continue on this journey of people analytics. Personally, I find it I mean, I have a bit of a techie background as well, so I like to dig into the codes and the numbers and understanding how integrations work and not just put it into a black box, which it could feel like sometimes when you have someone else managing it. I do think there's merit to both. As I said, here we already had spent quite a lot of time and effort on building a data warehouse. And similarly at Deliver Hero, there was already some work started. And then I think it sort of depends on your customers as well. What is expected? How much of branding and what sort of how do you consume the data? If it's just people analytics on its own, I think the vendors are still doing a great job. We, as I said, we have this whole DNA community, and if we want, as you said, one-stop shop or something like this, then it might be difficult to have one solution for every hub essentially. This is how we present data. Maybe we have less flexibility in how we present it and visualize it. And I do see many people, even if you do buy a solution, then people tend to augment it with some kind of, you know, additional analytics tool that or visualization tool because it won't answer everything. So I think partly it becomes down to the investment. How big is your team? How big do you expect to be? Because you can't really do the build efficiently with, you know, one, two, three people. It will be very time consuming. So if that's the ambition, or maybe there's cost saving initiatives, maybe it's more cost efficient to go with a buy solution. If you are building something wider, I think that the build solution tends to be more flexible, a bit more control. At the same time, I know like Richard Rosenau, we spoke to him about this a couple of months ago, and how the build solution, or so the buy solutions, or the vendors really now they've done it in so many organizations. They have a lot of customers, so they know many of the pitfalls. So if you're starting out with brand new people who don't have any experience in HR, then buy might also be a solution because there is a lot of complexities and also how we manage data. We have GDPR, data privacy, and security issues. So yeah, lots of back and forth, I would say. For us, looking at the whole data mesh concept, it made more sense to go with a build solution.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, again, we could probably do a whole episode on this, to be honest with you. But
Yeah,
I mean, you know, as you said, it really you've got to look at your organisational situation, the people that you've got, the skills that you've got, you know, what ultimately you're trying to achieve, I guess. You know, and you might come up with a different answer depending on what you've got there. So yeah, very very interesting. Well, that gets us to the question of the series. This is the last question. I can't believe we've got there already, Henrik. And this will be, you're able to talk a bit more about talent intelligence and workforce planning. We can have a good conversation around this. So how do you leverage people analytics to inform strategic workforce planning initiatives?
well, I think people analytics should be the baseline of before you get started with strategic workforce planning. I already talked about the source of truth, but if we don't know today, how are we going to know tomorrow? That's essentially my point of view with why people analytics and strategic workforce planning is very closely connected. I do think the third leg of that is talent intelligence as well, because we also need the external perspective. If we blindly look at what we have internally, then we might make decisions that do not sync at all with what's available on the market, where in terms of, especially in the world we live in today with very fast changes in terms of political situations. We have wars going on in places we perhaps didn't expect, which impacts talent availability, and maybe if we have sites in countries that are affected, all of this sort of the geopolitical risk is very high. Um, I think strategic workforce planning has a potential to be a very strong influence on the bottom line of the company if you do it right. And if you look at people analytics, you can highlight the internal trends. You can start seeing what's going on in the company, sort of a health check and tendencies that happens within the company. Talent intelligence then brings that external point of view with what's going on the market. As I said, it's rarely comprehensive data, especially if you go to some countries. Maybe you can say, oh, well, let's just look at LinkedIn, what's going on. But many countries don't use LinkedIn. They use other tools, or maybe it's just government data you have to rely on. And then you have to rely on if that government data is reliable or not. But I think bringing that internal perspective, the external perspective from these different functions, I think is key to help you develop a solid strategic workforce planning. With the world moving fast, also comes, especially now we see with ChatGPT and AI and skills, even that moves very quickly. So even if we decide today to establish a tech hub somewhere, maybe all of a sudden all of those skills are much more readily available somewhere else. We can't just focus on cost and convenience anymore. We need to be mindful. I've had I've had stakeholders who say, let's just ask ChatGPT what to do. Well, what if everyone does that? Then everyone will build in the same places. So I think investing in talent intelligence for me is why that's so important to get ahead of the curve and start thinking, what's going on in Africa, for example. There's universities betting on skills that we need in the coming years. So perhaps that should be some focus for us. That's not something you can Google or figure out based on looking just at people analytics internal data. So for me, that's the holy trinity of developing solid strategic workforce planning, with people analytics informing and also getting the business input from strategic workforce planning, talent intelligence, bringing the external perspective, and also SWP essentially guiding both the people analytics and talent intelligence what to focus on, so that we can improve our bottom line in the end.
Mm. Well, and as you said, particularly in an organisation like Volvo Cars, it's transforming, like many organisations are, many industries are. It's the talent intelligence helps you understand what your competitors are doing, what skills they're acquiring, maybe, and where they're acquiring them, and all those sorts of things that can really help your workforce planning. And as you said, I think that was a very astute comment, that if you get strategic workforce planning right, that's going to have a huge impact on company performance and financial performance. So it kind of makes sense to put those three legs of the stool together: people analytics, workforce planning, and talent intelligence.
Yeah, because just to add to that, I mean, for example, the people listening part as well is to understand, again, internal, but we should also listen to what's going on in the market. And as you rightly said, we're going through a huge digital transformation. We used to be fully a manufacturing company. Now we're a digital and manufacturing company with lots of software engineers and software, which is then we also need to learn from others who were born out of technology. If you look at some of our competitors, it's a very competitive space. So we need to be on our toes to make sure we do the right things. And I think this is where people analytics, talent intelligence, strategic workforce planning can really matter for us.
No, you try, and you highlighted another thing: the demographic challenges. We're both in Europe. We're probably, I don't know exactly, but I suspect that we're both in countries where the workforce is shrinking, people retiring, people not having as many children. There are other parts of the world, you mentioned Africa, which is the best example, where there are, birth rates very high. There's going to be more people in the workforce. And if we can attract people with the right skills from some of those countries, so that's going to solve some of our workforce challenges that we're increasingly going to have in the coming years. And as you said, that information doesn't reside within the company. You need to be looking at external data to understand that. So I think that's a really good point. Henrik, it's been it always is a pleasure speaking to you. It's been a particular pleasure speaking to you today on the Digital HR Leaders podcast. Before we wrap up, where can our listeners find out more about you and connect with you? Perhaps, I'm guessing LinkedIn is probably the best answer.
I would say LinkedIn is always the answer. You can find me there. As you know, I write articles and post videos of conferences and stuff I attend. Of course, be happy to meet some of the listeners as well at conferences. Do plan to attend a few in the coming year as well. But LinkedIn is definitely the best place.
Good, and I can definitely recommend the articles that Henrik writes. It's always good to hear from practitioners in the space directly, and Henrik is one of those practitioners that does from time to time pen some very interesting articles. So Henrik, thanks very much, and I look forward to seeing you probably at some point in the new year, and I wish you a great holiday in Florida.
Thank you so much, David. It's been a pleasure.
In this series, we will be speaking to a range of senior leaders who are pushing a data-driven and digital HR agenda. Make sure that you subscribe via your podcast app of choice and also via our YouTube channel for free and regular interviews with the digital HR leaders of the future.